While the Arab conquests were changing the dynamics in the western front of the ocean, on the eastern side you still had things going as before, with the east coast of India trading a lot with Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia though, what you see at this time is a lot of political upheaval. The Java and Srivijaya kingdoms began expanding beyond their borders, and in Cambodia you see that the Khmers were undergoing a lot of political instability. Now at this period of political instability, you had the rise of a king called Jayavarman who ascended to the throne. Under him, the kingdom managed to strengthen its borders, and in the years to come, they began taking over neighboring areas and founded the Angkor Empire. Now, internal strife in the Angkor Empire often resulted in outsiders marrying into the family and staking their claim to the throne. At its height, though, Angkor would have been the largest urban agglomeration in the world, with over 1 million residents possibly living in it. Back in South India, at the end of the 9th century, you saw the resurgence of the Cholas. Even while the Pallavas were ruling, the Cholas retained some clout and eventually decided to overthrow them. They took over most of South India and even parts of northern Sri Lanka, and under the rule of Rajendra Chola, they made their way all the way to the banks of the Ganges. Now, geopolitics in Southeast Asia were really crucial at this time because it's through here that most of Indo-Chinese trade used to take place. Now, there were two trade routes for this trade to go through. One was through the Straits of Malacca, which was controlled by the Srivijaya Empire, and for the south, you had trade through the Sunda Straits, which was controlled by the Javans. Now, there was often conflict between the Srivijayans and the Javans for supremacy in the region, and you often had India and China getting involved to ensure the stability of trade and maintain the geopolitical balance. Maritime trade was clearly an important driver of geopolitical developments over here, and in South India this trade was more often than not conducted through merchant guilds that were financed not by the kings but by the vast network of temples over here. So the temples then became the center of cultural, social and economic life. Now in the 11th century you had the Cholas being challenged by the Chalukyas from the north, and in trying to defend themselves they lost control of the Sri Lankan territories in the south. Following this, Sri Lanka was then plunged into a civil war, and you had the rise of an Odia prince called Nisanka Malla who came and claimed the throne on the basis of his descent from Kalinga rulers of the past. He also then declared that only Buddhists would be allowed to rule Sri Lanka, which then created the link between Buddhism and Sri Lankan politics, which has had a very major impact till today. Now, the Cholas then decided to back their own Odia prince called Magha, and so you have an interesting situation where you have two Odia princes in the heart of what is now seen as a Tamil Sinhala conflict. A Malay prince also decided to back the Cholas against the Sinhalas, but was unsuccessful in doing so. Eventually, later, the Pandyas then occupied the northern part of Sri Lanka, creating the Tamil kingdom of Jaffna, which you see even today. Just as the eastern side of the ocean was very well connected at this time, so too was the western side. Now, I've already mentioned that the rise of the Abbasid Empire gave a great boost to trade over here, and this boost was further bolstered by the setting up of large business networks by Jewish merchants all the way from the Mediterranean region to India. On the east coast of Africa, you saw the rise of a number of Persian and Arabic settlements. Now, these settlements were populated mostly by fleeing dissident Muslims who married locals and created composite cultures in areas like Mombasa, Mogadishu and Zanzibar. These settlements became prosperous ports because they traded in two key commodities, slaves and gold. The politics of interior Africa were also obviously affected by this wealth, and you saw the rise of kingdoms like Mapungabwe, which then later gave way to Greater Zimbabwe. Now, items of trade from across the Indian Ocean rim have been uncovered over here. Impressive architectural structures have also been discovered, but colonial era historians interestingly refused to believe that prior to the arrival of Europeans, Africans could have built structures like these. So what they then said was that there was likely an ancient migration from the north, and it was these northerners who then constructed these structures. At the end of the 12th century, what you have is the Indian Ocean being divided into two zones of influence. You had the Islamic zone from the east coast of Africa till Central Asia, and the Indic zone from Afghanistan to Southeast Asia. Now, this was disrupted quite significantly by Turkic raids into the subcontinent, which eventually also culminated in the rise of the Delhi Sultanate. The Mongols under Genghis Khan also made similar raids into Asia, though they did so through Central Asia and not through the subcontinent. Now, in these raids, you had temples, universities, cities, and entire populations that were laid to waste, and the destruction of some key institutions really resulted in India withdrawing quite significantly from Indian Ocean trade. This vacuum that they left was later filled by the Arabs and the Chinese. Maritime activity as a whole, though, recovered soon enough, and interestingly, you have a lot of travelers who are making this way through the region. Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta are two whose accounts have reached us till today, and their writings tell us about, the local politics and local life across the region. Marco Polo, for example, tells us that Chinese ships were the largest that were plying in the Indian Ocean. He had made his way from India to China via Southeast Asia, and he also tells us that at this time you had the kingdom of Champa being quite devastated by the Mongol raids, and the Sri Vijaya Empire being broken up into several small Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms. Though India's contribution to it declined quite significantly following the Turco-Mongol raids, Indian Ocean trade in general survived. The Mongols held sway all the way till the kingdom of Champa, and in nearby Java you see the emergence of the Majapahit Empire under the rule of the king Kirtarajsa. Now, the Majapahits, in trying to expand their geopolitical reach across Southeast Asia, often found themselves in conflict with the Ming dynasty from China, who were trying to do the same. The Mings, under the rule of King Yongli, created a grand fleet of ships known as the Dragon Fleet, which were to make voyages across the Indian Ocean in order to increase their political reach. Under the leadership of the Admiral Zheng He, the Dragon Fleet made 7 voyages across the ocean, going to areas ranging from Southeast Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Oman, Persia, and even the east coast of Africa. Now, while doing so, they often intervened in local politics and installed favourable rulers wherever they could, including installing rulers from the Nair community in Calicut. In Southeast Asia, they supported the kingdom of Malacca to counter the growing influence of the Majapahits, and also encouraged conversion to Islam amongst the locals to create an opposition to Hinduism and prevent the creation of an anti-Chinese alliance. Large and long-standing empires were to fall soon one after another in Southeast Asia in the 15th century. The kingdom of Malacca led a Muslim alliance against the Majapahits and took over the region. The Angkors were attacked by the Thais, who, with the tacit support of the Mings, were able to defeat them. And the Chams in South Vietnam were defeated by the rising Dai Viet, thus ending a dynasty that had ruled the region for over 1.5 millennia. Now, on the Western Front, this is the time that you see Europe trying to make an inroad into the Indian Ocean. So far, the Arabs had held a stronghold over the route through the Middle East and Persia. Fantastical stories about India and the Indian Ocean had reached Europe, though these stories were largely fabrications by people like John Mandeville, but they significantly increased their interest in the area. In the 15th century, you see Portugal being the first to act, and they spent a great amount of time doing reconnaissance work, which also included sending spies into the Arab world to prepare for their journey. Finally, in 1497, Vasco da Gama made his way around the Cape of Good Hope, trying to reach India. So he made his way around the tip of Africa and up the east coast, but on the east coast he faced a lot of problems because of political rivalries with the Arabs. Luckily, in the port of Mahindi, the Sultan agreed to send a guide with them to help them reach India, and finally they landed in the port of Calicut in May 1498. The local ruler, the Samudrin, allowed Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese to begin trading in pepper and spices, though this greatly angered the Arabs, who so far had a monopoly on this trade. The next fleet of Portuguese that arrived demanded that only they be allowed to engage in trade and that the Arabs be expelled. Now, this obviously angered the locals and resulted in conflict, which was actually won by the Portuguese. And this then marks the beginning of European supremacy in the Indian Ocean. They soon took over most trade in the Western Ocean region and built bases all along the coast here. And the most known bases in India are Goa and Diu. Sometime later, through voyages led by Francisco Serrao and Ferdinand Magellan, they made their way to Southeast Asia as well. They arrived in Bombay in 1509, and after a brutal raid in the area, established a small enclave for themselves. Now, the settlers here were people who were fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition back home, where Muslims and Jews were being persecuted. Soon after, though, you had Francis Xavier bring the Inquisition to the subcontinent, where local places of worship were destroyed and the populations here forced to convert to Christianity.